Welcome, sinners. I'm Jason,
And I'm Rebecca, also known as Emily Sin.
and this is the Sanctuary of Sin podcast. We will cover everything delectably sinful, from kink and queer culture to cults, sex positivity, and everything in between.
Let's get sinful.
So, in today's episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into probably the most interesting, at least for us, deadly sin: lust.
Lust is an intense craving or desire, often for sexual pleasure. It's a primal human drive shaped by culture, religion, and personal experience. Lust plays a key role in human sexuality. It fuels attraction, intimacy, and pleasure, and can deepen connection when expressed consensually.
However, its impact goes beyond the personal. Lust has been both celebrated and condemned throughout history, seen as essential for passion and creativity, but also labelled as dangerous or immoral. It's this tension that makes lust so powerful. It drives industries, relationships, and revolutions, whilst also sparking fear, shame, and control.
So, segment 1, historical perspectives, starting with religious condemnation. Genesis 4:7. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it.
Alright, folks, buckle up. We're diving deep into one of the most iconic boners in theological history. That's right, we're talking about Saint Augustine, a man whose teenage shame basically invented slut shaming as we know it.
I had such a field day with this research, and I swear, like, our friends and family are probably sick of me talking about this guy at this point, because it's just, I've just got totally hooked. Like, I read his book, man. We'll get into that later, but
Yeah.
I have done a deep dive and a half on this one. Very, very interested.
Aye, I've seen you squirreling away, spending plenty of hours just reading, and every so often popping your head up to give me a snippet of a story or yeah.
Now, lust has always been knocking around as a bit of a biblical no-no, but it didn't really make the all-star shin squad until Augustine got his hands on it. In 397, he penned his infamous Confessions, 13 books of guilt-ridden rambling addressed to God, which essentially rebranded sex as humanity's original screw-up.
All of this can be traced back to one embarrassing moment in his teenage life. At 16, his father took him to the local baths where he conceivably got a hormonal boner and wanted the floor to eat him up. His dad, rather than ignoring the scene, proceeded to get absolutely buzzing that he was going to have grandchildren soon and proceeded to rush home and tell his wife, Augustine's mum. His mother, being frightfully religious, did not take this well. You can imagine how horrible this must have been for him, and set him on one of the most influential and damaging journeys in sex positive, or negative as the case may be, history.
So this was like quite an interesting reading that, do you know, I feel he himself wasn't religious at this point. I've left quite a lot of his kind of story out just because there was so much there to kind of speak about and discuss, and I just thought it was too much for just like a segment in this episode, but I'm sure we will cover him again at some point because there is a lot to unpack there, a lot that I haven't touched. You can put himself in this position here, do you know, where he's had this embarrassing thing happen, and both these parents, having reacted in such like different ways, have still both created this kind of almost like traumatizing event for him that he spent the rest of his life trying to like fix. Like,
yeah, I mean, if something like that happens to you at that age, all you want is for everybody to pretend it didn't happen.
Yeah.
You know, they were both quite extreme reactions to that, and that kind of thing would definitely stick with you.
Definitely. So, while he was not religious when young and rampantly shagged anything with a pulse, even stealing pears as an act of rebellion of God's will, once converted, he really struggled with control over his own needs and felt this was the source of all the evil in the world. His penis was quite literally the source of all the world's problems.
Quote, sometimes it refuses to act when the mind wills, while often it acts against its will. His strong need and search for body autonomy, paired with his 15-year-long obsession to take every word written in Genesis as literal, led to his own creation, the concept of original sin. He believed that Adam and Eve wouldn't have had sex in the usual way, but instead, quote, they would not have had the activity of turbulent lust in their flesh, however, but only the movement of peaceful will by which we command the other members of the body.
Don't know why this immediately brings fists into mind, but hey, I was speaking to one of our friends about this, and like me and him had such a laugh, like thinking about penises being like totally within your control, like elephant trunks, like pure being able to like pick things up and that. Like laughed for like 5 minutes, genuinely like fucking peeling bananas and stuff. Like. But yeah, wild. To kind of speak a wee bit about the Genesis stuff, like I feel like everybody that I research, I always end up thinking is pure autism coded. But like that for me, do you know, this like obsessive need. 15 years is a long time to spend.
That's not like a wee
side hobby. Do you know, this man spent like a decent chunk of his adult life like trying to make it so that every single word in a book could be taken as literal. Like he got really caught up on. There's a bit in Genesis where they're talking about Adam and Eve's eyes being opened for the first time.
Yeah.
3 years he spent on that. 3 years he couldn't he couldn't get past it. He got stuck on how they could possibly have literally had their eyes closed up until this moment. And yeah, it's just wild, so interesting. So he believed that God created us with full control of our genitals. Now there's a party trick. His proof of this being, quote, some people can even move their ears, either one at a time or both together, and, quote, produce at will such musical sounds from their behind, without any stink, that they seem to be singing from that region. So I find it really interesting that this is his kind of evidence for this, and that, like, do you know, in order to almost do like the mental gymnastics to make this like not only possible but true and like undeniably true, do you know, Bible true, that like he's just picking on what I can only assume is stuff he's seen at like a circus or something somewhere.
I mean, it very much reminds me of stuff that you would see on the playground at primary school.
Yeah, like, totally. Quite a childlike way looking at the world. For reading about, like, this was in his book. All these quotes are from his book, which I don't think I said. But aye, clutching at straws.
Definitely seems like it. It's wild how he's, you know, from that kind of one big embarrassing moment, he's pulled so much in from round about him in his life to form this sort of like ideology.
Yeah. This is why I thought this was like a really important and why like thing to talk about, and why I found it so interesting is that, you know, like through his teachings and through his ideologies and stuff, he has been labelled as one of the most influential Western philosophers of his time. In terms of like the kind of effect that he's had ongoing from like total like butterfly moment, and it can all be traced back to this one very human moment in his life that he's just spent the rest of the time trying to almost undo and make it not his fault, but not God's fault either, because that would be blasphemous. And it you know, I think this is what's got him really turned round about, and like this 3-year kind of stint that he spent on the kind of Adam and Eve story, that one like fact that got stuck that he couldn't make true. This is where things have got so almost like wild and out of proportion to like reality, because he's had to create and weave this narrative of it's no his fault this happened, it's no his parents' fault this happened, it's no God's fault this has happened, it must be just humanity is wrong.
Aye, it's all kind of been born out of like his desperation to uphold the values that he sees as important.
Yeah.
So he theorised that only through Eve biting the apple, lust was discovered. Quote, they turned their eyes on their own genitals and lusted after them with that stirring movement they had not previously known.
Do you often find yourself lusting after your own genitals?
I mean, not usually.
Not kink shaming, just curious. Anyway, all of this led him to the concept that shagging was the original sin, and was so loud about this that he paved the way, reinventing the Adam and Eve story and bringing it back from almost obscurity. The minds at the time were less convinced of talking snakes and magic trees than we are today. As part of this, he decreed that any and all sex, even within a married couple, is sinful unless for the purposes of procreation. Quote, "But when it must come to man's great function of the procreation of children," he writes, "the members which were expressly created for this purpose will not obey the direction of the will, but lust has to be waited for to set these members in motion, as if it had legal right over them. But the action is not performed without evil."
Amazing how one erection has changed the course of human history forever. Maybe if his dad had sat him down and, had the talk, human sexuality as we know it today would be vastly different. But instead, slut-shaming within Christianity was born.
Moving on to the demonization of sexuality. Peter 2:11. "Beloved, I urge you, so sojourners and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul."
The demonization of sexuality, especially within religion, has not always been so prevalent. Before people realised that sex and childbirth were linked, it is suggested that many of the religions were matriarchal in nature, celebrating the wonder of women and their ability to create life. Even male dominion within society is thought to have only begun around 12,000 years ago, after the introduction of agriculture and military, with a need for women to stay at home and produce more workers and soldiers.
I find it really interesting, considering that there was a time when people didn't realise that, sex and childbirth were linked at all. They just thought kids just randomly happened. Or probably had, rituals and stuff attached to... It was just the ritual worked. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And there was, in that kind of time, there was a lot more, parenting as a group.
Yeah.
Children would all kind of be raised together.
It takes a village and all
yeah,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until we started seeing things like land ownership and the introduction of succession and
inheritance
inheritance being so prevalent that it started to be important as to
whose kids were who.
Yeah.
We'll touch on that a wee bit later on, but it's hard to imagine a society where that isn't seen as important as it is today.
Aye.
So looking back to early Mesopotamia, some 4000 BC, and the discovery of the true nature of procreation, was when society first took on paternal lineage. This was the beginning of the patriarchy, and a much important link to the rise in the idea of sexual lust, especially in women, threatening the status quo. Women and their children became useful capital, a way of tracking inheritance, creating alliances, and holding on to lands and power. Shame is a powerful deterrent and has been a tool of the patriarchy and a pathway to capitalism as we know it today, controlling and oppressing society by managing the distribution and the flow of wealth. Religion has played an important role by not only greatly influencing social norms, but by providing a framework for people to live by and creating consequences to living outside this system. I think it's really important when you start looking at systems and why things are the way they are, is looking at who they benefit. It's a really good tool to see why these things have happened and came about and why they're kind of upheld as much as they are today.
Yeah, and I think with this subject in particular, there is a really clear paper trail of, this is who benefits from this.
Yeah.
Going all the way back, and this is why things are structured this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's clear to see how, social norms and kind of the influence of the people in power only go so far. And that's why religion has been so pivotal, and especially in the past, to generally being able to control massive amounts of people. Because it's put in this system where, there's forever consequences as opposed to just
it's not just you break the law and you go to jail.
Yeah.
And then you're back out.
But in the days, you had a roof over your head and you were fed, and to Probably not well, but
having that kind of deterrent of forever, for eternity, you're going to suffer the consequences of these actions. That's quite a big deterrent.
Yeah.
Even if it's, I'm not sure if I believe in that, but I'd rather not take the chance.
Exactly. It kind of creates this just in case kind of mentality that I don't think exists to the same. I feel like the difference as well is, you could break the law and not get caught. Nobody's like going out there and committing crimes and planning on going to jail. Like, there's always the possibility of like avoiding that.
Yeah.
Whereas with something like religion, God is always watching. There's this like you're forever like on CCTV essentially. And
there's no chance escaping the consequences of your actions.
And it means that you're then controlling what people are doing in private as well as public, which is the difference between that and like just regular laws, I would say.
Yeah, it's this kind of like totally pervasive way to exert control, even when there's no chance that there's anybody watching or, any chance of getting caught. There's this guy up in the sky that can see you all the time.
Yeah, and he knows all.
So I've got a quote here from Indian feminist journalist Nisha Amber. In almost all organised religions, restrictions exist over a woman's choices over her body, sexuality, lifestyle, clothes, and just about everything. Sexuality and reproductive rights is especially the problem area with regard to women. Almost all religions advocate sexual exclusivity for women while exonerating men from the same obligation.
So this can also be seen when looking at historical kings and leaders from the past. In stark contrast to the rules seen within their societies at the time, many male rulers enjoyed a hedonistic lifestyle with many wives, lovers, harems, or mistresses. Even within the Bible, quote from David Tyan's podcast. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, King Solomon, the son of King David, is recorded as having 300 wives and 700 concubines. If he slept with a new woman every night, it would take him 2 years and almost 9 months to see each of them just once. And that's just one of many examples throughout history.
There's always kind of existed this double standard.
Yep. Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. Men and women are kind of operating off totally different sets of rules, as we just heard in that quote from Nisha Amber. In all these different areas of their lives, there is a different expectation on men versus women.
Yeah, and I feel like religion just kind of hammers that home. That's true out with religion as well, but I feel like, as we've kind of touched on, like religion has been this tool that kind of moralizes this difference and kind of makes it, like, justifies it in a way, because it always comes down to, like, man was created in God's image and, like, women in the apple and Eve, and with the help of Augustine, that being a lot more prevalent and a lot more kind of leaned on as, like, a moral story to exist by. Obviously, Nisha Amber's discussing more religion within India, which will be out with Christianity mostly. But this is just a thing that, again, it's coming back to what I'd said before about when we look at these systems and like who it benefits. The fact that that is dotted and true throughout so many different religions throughout the world is showing its true purpose, and that like it's less about like beliefs and more about like a system of control that has been utilised literally everywhere to just perpetuate the kind of patriarchal system and keep it functioning.
This distinction was used as a way to separate the top 1% who were above the rules of the masses. It showed their status and their power. Controlling the lust of the rest of the population was a way to establish order and keep things stable within the masses. Controlling sexual exclusivity unfortunately always leads to a greater focus on controlling women. As time went on, even the aristocracy had to adhere to a new set of rules regarding sexuality. Marriages and sex were tools in arranging alliances, gaining strength and power, as well as consolidating wealth. Heirs of dubious inheritance threatened this system, and thus women continued to be objectified. Their worth and their existence based on their fidelity and fertility. This kept the higher classes in check, but what of the rest of society? This is where patriarchal religion steps in. Making lust and adultery a sin allowed there to be not only societal consequences to lewd behaviour, but spiritual ones as well. We can still feel this shame echoed through society today in the form of sex education and sexual topics still having a taboo nature.
I find it really interesting how they've had to use almost like different tools to upkeep these rules within the different classes.
Mm-hmm.
Because for the higher classes that previously had kind of been above this rule, because of the way that they were existing and the way they were living their life, do you know?
Aye, like the divine right of kings and all
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
You know.
As we moved away from feudalism and kind of having just like a king and more into having like kind of the rich class and the poorer classes, it's kind of had to adapt over time because there wasn't this divine right, as you said, that kind of still existed within. Do you know, it wasn't seen that people that were rich were like chosen by God to be in these positions in the way that it had been in the past, and therefore religion still being used to kind of control the masses could no longer like allow these people to be with that system.
Aye,
But
the higher-ups had to start toeing the line as well.
Yeah. But they understood how it worked and why it was, and therefore it was more about reputation and like holding on to inheritance and all the stuff that we've kind of mentioned. Like it was more practical than it was spiritual.
Ensuring the family line and making sure it was still their family that was.
And like I feel like that's a whole other topic, but do you know, this is something that can still be seen today in your kind of upper classes who see like their bloodline being the most important and it being like potentially disturbed by like marrying below their station. Do you know, I feel like there's still a bit of that goes on.
Wealthier people, they tend to be having more children because they are looking to leave a legacy and to have, you know.
That's what drives them to toe the line, as you've said, and stay within the system, as opposed to, I'm not saying religion's still prevalent these days, but I feel like there's still echoes of it in the way that, you know, the stigma and the taboo and the kind of the shame that exists within society today, especially surrounding sex, is this kind of like leftover from when religion was used as the framework for people to live by.
Yeah.
So moving on to the sex positivity movement, Corinthians 6:18, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body.
So there have been many sexual liberation movements over the last 100 years or so. As Western society moved further from religion and authoritative ideologies, outdated views around sex and sexuality began to be questioned.
The sexual revolution was the fight for people's sex lives to be a source of pleasure and fulfillment, to be more than reproduction and not just a part of the institution of marriage. These previous notions being a large part of the repression of homosexuality. The movement sought to shake free from sexual repression and this form of political and societal control. Quote from Elaine Guillaume, Sexual Liberation and Sexual Revolutions. The sexual revolution was thus based on the notion that the struggle for sexual liberation is a powerful political lever for social emancipation. So this was another absolute deep dive for me through all this because I just found it so interesting. Do you know, it's something that I've heard about, something I've read about before, but never quite in the context that kind of researching for this particular topic brought me to.
Yeah.
And that, do you know, I've always seen that the sexual revolution was fought by people in the queer community, people in the trans community, people in like the feminist communities, like they were all standing together. And this brought them all together to kind of fight for their rights and fight for their voice. But I never thought about why this particular topic was the one that brought them all together until I started reading through this, and it's been amazing. It's been such a wild ride.
Aye, because if the kind of moral framework is that everything was to be, you know, all sexual activity was to be contained within marriage and for the purposes of reproduction, that entirely excludes anybody that does not conform to like a heterosexual relationship.
And even those within a heterosexual relationship that have no like autonomy within that because of these rules. And that makes total sense. You know, it's maybe pretty obvious to other people, but I just had never thought about it quite in that context before.
Yeah.
And it just clicked for me, and I totally see why like this is a fight that, you know, has been at the forefront of all of these like massive movements through the last 100 years. It's been great.
So this movement did not start in the 60s, but has become synonymous with this time period due to both massive scientific discoveries at the time and the free love movement. Medical science began to truly pull away from their previous allegiance with the Catholic Church, creating more avenues for people to have sex without any worry about reproduction. With availability of the contraceptive pill through the NHS in 1961, the revolution was well underway. However, when first prescribed, these were only available to married women in the worry that they would lead to sexual promiscuity. These discoveries paved the way for feminists and LGBTQIA+ movements to be legitimised in the name of science and give them a foundation to fight for legislative changes. Free love, in and of itself, was the idea of love free from legal ties rather than promiscuity as it was expressed in the media. Sexual battles became a cornerstone in the fight for emancipation. In 1967, abortion became decriminalised in the UK due to one such movement by the Abortion Law Reform Association, or the ALRA. The bill made it to Parliament 7 times before it was passed. During the same year, the 1967 Sexual Offences Act passed in the UK. It decriminalised private homosexual acts between two men over 21 in England and Wales. This act didn't make its way to Scotland until 1980.
I had never realised it was as late as that. Do you know, when you think about like homosexuality being illegal, I always think the 60s. Just because I think the 60s and the 70s.
Yep.
But like, aye, wild.
I think Scotland's got this kind of slightly stronger hold on like
The kind of religious influence and stuff.
religious suppression of sexual stuff. Things are a wee bit more repressed here. It's a wee bit more kind of...
Which is so interesting because, do you know, Scotland's paving the way in so many other ways. In terms of, do you know, it was the first place that like pads and tampons had to be available in like public places for people for free. Do you know, there's things that we have been at the forefront of in terms of women's health that is quite anti-religion in the ways that we've kind of discussed, but so behind the times in other ways, especially when it comes to like homosexuality and stuff.
It's kind of like the kind of modern position is all for the sort of the healthcare aspect of things, but still quite repressed and quite almost like shying away from the actual sexual aspect of things.
Yeah,
like it's the sexual part
Side
of things and the enjoyment part of things that's kind of what makes people a bit nervous, a bit sort
cringy,
of
yeah. Aye, I find it really interesting as well. This is the first time I've came across about the free love movement and the kind of propaganda surrounding it within the media. Do you know, when I think free love, I think promiscuity. Do you know that is how it has always been kind of labelled and fed to me over the years.
The swinging 60s.
The swinging 60s, totally. And in fact, it was actually about freedom from oppression and has yet again been twisted and distorted and changed to suit a certain narrative.
Yeah, that was really quite sort of interesting to find out that it wasn't, that it was just, you know, orgies and swinging and...
There was all that going on as well,
Absolutely,
don't get me wrong, but it was a political statement doing that in a sense, or at least partially, which like gives it a whole new fucking meaning to me. Like,
aye, that context has always been missing from anything I've ever heard about that.
It's made me like so happy and proud as well that like, do you know, this is part of the kind of theme for our upcoming market with Uncensored, and like it's just gave it this whole other kind of lease of life to me that I wish I had known in going like from the beginning, but like I'm definitely going to be leaning on from now on because like it's just chef's kiss, like great. So great, so relevant just now as well with everything that's going on. You know, people should be able to just fucking live their lives, man. In every aspect.
Yeah, aye. Like, the law shouldn't be preventing people from living their happy life.
Yeah, and loving whoever they want to love.
Yeah.
Including them fucking selves. So, the 60s paved the way for the rise of sexuality. not only being a tool for liberation, but a source of personal empowerment and self-expression. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, the sexual revolution adapted and changed, its focus becoming wider and stronger, growing into an ideology. Body autonomy, reproductive health, women's rights, gay marriage, acceptance of pornography and sex work. People's right to choose what they do with their own body and what life they choose to lead was at the forefront of the sexual revolution. This later gave way to sex positivity, a term first coined in the early 90s. Sex positivity is used to encompass an openness to a variety of sexual orientations, interests or lack thereof, identities and expressions. This was part of a global change in attitudes towards sexuality that had a pivotal moment in 2002 when the World Health Organization updated its definition of sexual health to include pleasure. This led to more general acceptance of joy as a part of sexual expression, leading to more open and light-hearted discussions and influenced the creation of organisations with this value at heart. Quote, "Sex positive is really the opposite of sex negative," says Queen, which means being judgmental about sex and sexual variation. In my opinion, this is the ground out of which the notion of sex positivity grew. Although it's kind of synonymous with the 60s, there was growth in this movement over the 70s and 80s that kind of moved up and got to the extent where it got a rebrand because the fights kind of moved elsewhere. And I feel like this is where things started to kind of get a bit more segregated and split between the different kind of sects of feminism, of like the gay rights movement, of trans rights. Do you know, I feel like all these things started kind of blossoming into their own like places and spaces rather than kind of sticking together and fighting as one, as was kind of necessary to do.
Aye, because after the sort of initial changes that were made, certain groups' focuses became more specific and more niche
to their own
interests, which the other groups.
Well, this is where like the TERFs and the SWERFs come in. Do you know? As people kind of got more polarised through their different like opinions and views on stuff, and like different kind of sections of things started popping up, it has kind of like, rather than the I don't want to call them the big fights because there is obviously still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
But if you take where we're at just now, in terms, maybe ignoring the last year and a half, let's say, because, oh my god, that's a whole other fucking discussion. But up until that point, do you know, if you took any of the issues that we're facing now and compared them to where people were in the same position 100 years ago, they're unrecognisable for each other.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what's kind of lost a bit of the fire for some people, not in terms of their own things that only matter and affect them, but in terms of like the other groups that are maybe, I don't know how to word this. I feel like people feel that standing as a group for things that don't affect you weakens your claim.
Yeah, and I think that's all sort of come about with the way that the opposition has evolved as well.
Yeah.
The opposition has evolved to, you know, the way that things are spoken about in the papers and the news, and it's all designed to polarize people and to
segregate them,
and fragment that fight so that they're not as strong.
Yeah. Do you know,
it's far easier for them to
deal with 5 groups of 20 people than 100 people.
Correct.
And this is why, do you know, it's something that I feel so strongly about. Like, if you are standing up for people, stand up for every fucking vulnerable person out there, because our voices only matter when they're loud and all together. Do you know, like, that's the only time that like we see change happening. And I feel like looking back through the 60s and 70s and 80s, we have massive amounts of evidence for this in terms of the amount of change these people managed to get to happen by all grouping together and standing as one and uniting and showing a united front.
Talking broad strokes, the movement made progress when everybody was together.
Yeah.
This is the point we're trying to get.
Yeah.
The status quo has learned if they fragment anything that's in opposition to them, they stand a far greater chance of overcoming it.
Mm-hmm. Especially if those people are like in the minority to begin with, do you know, where a lot of the oppressed groups are. That's how that kind of works.
Yeah, that's really the importance of them banding together and supporting each other's causes, even if they don't think it affects them. It's that the power is in being allies and having allies.
Yeah.
Lending a greater voice to each and every cause.
Mm-hmm. Which all at the end of the day have the same goal, which is to get out under the fucking boot of the patriarchy. Like, let's argue about how that looks after that's happened. Is always my point. Do you know, I'm not saying that people shouldn't have their opinions, even if they're wrong. But, like, why is that opinion worth more to you than your own oppression?
Yeah.
And and other people's oppression. This is the bit that gets to me. Like, if you are really fighting and really having a voice for getting rid of oppression, everything else should be secondary to that.
Aye, absolutely. I mean, like, rather than tearing down other people to make yourself feel better or feel more powerful, raise everybody round you up, and you can squabble about the details once everybody's in this better position.
Yeah. Aye, like, save it. Do you know, save it for a later date. Like, why is that your main focus just now?
Aye, take the big steps and worry about the details after the fact.
Yeah.
So the sex positivity movement today is really centred around education, self-discovery, and embracing the complex, multifaceted realm of human sexuality. It's much more generally accepted now, to the point where it's becoming a bit of a corporate buzzword like inclusivity or diversity, with brands trying to appear sympathetic to the cause. Moving away from the porn wars of the 70s and 80s, this new wave of sex positivity is creating far more frank, open, and honest discussion around sexuality. With that said, the fight is far from over. In fact, sex workers and trans rights have faced even more pushback in recent years. But overall, people are more empowered by their sexuality. It's something celebrated openly, a badge of honour, in a way that's so different from the levels of resilience needed to do the same thing in the past. At its heart, sex positivity is about one thing: your body is your own.
Thanks for joining us, you filthy little sinners. We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
We're keeping this podcast deliciously ad-free, so if you want to support what we do, head over to our Patreon and join our Church of Sin.
If you're craving some new personally recommended kink gear, check out our website, thesanctuaryofsin.com, for all your naughty needs, and use the code SINPOD at checkout for a 15% discount.
Got ideas, feedback, or just want to tell us what made you blush? We'd love to hear from you.
You can find all our socials, including Instagram, Twitter, and FetLife, on our Linktree, which is linktree/thesanctuaryofsin. Thank you for sinning with us.
And don't forget to tune in next time for our next confession.